Welcome to the Safe to Love Again podcast. Do you ever feel like you can't read the weather in your own relationships? You think it's going to be a sunny day, and out of nowhere, a storm front rolls in, and it keeps happening until you start wondering if your internal relational forecaster is about as reliable as an old farmer's almanac. Here's what's actually going on. Somewhere along the way, for a lot of us, the instrument that reads your weather and your feelings, well, they got switched off. And you got so good at forecasting without it that nobody around you could tell it was off, except the people closest to you. They could always tell. And then, so did you. I'm so glad you're here with me today. In this episode, I'm going to make the case, using real neuroscience, not sentiment, that your feelings are the natural way to read the true weather report in your relationships. Unlike what our culture tries to tell us, your emotions aren't some kind of non-logical static getting in the way of clear relational thinking. They're your natural, life-given barometer for reading love and life itself. In fact, neuroscience has now shown that without feelings, there's no consciousness of me at all. And we're going to delve into the role that emotional access plays in business leadership, believe it or not. If you've ever wondered why you make certain bad decisions, as well as relational ones maybe, I'm going to help you understand that in a very different way. Of course, this applies to all of your relationships as well. And I'm going to show you why so many of us had it backwards. Why I think, therefore I am, was never actually true. And why the real sentence is, I feel, therefore I am. I am, therefore I feel. Let's get started getting your best, most accurate emotional weather forecaster up and running so you can have the calm and loving relationship you want. We'll begin with a funny story about how I created this episode. I sometimes must remind myself just how much our emotions regulate and influence nearly every process in our brain. As I began prepping for this episode, the first two drafts helped me gather my thoughts. The second one was pretty good on the science, very good, in fact. And my logical brain was quietly congratulating itself. This is going quite well, I said to myself. And then my emotional brain stepped in and whispered, seriously? How can you write about feelings from a mostly logical stance? If you want this essay to be persuasive and truly on target, start writing something that people can feel in their bones. I laughed out loud. There was a time I could never have accessed my emotional awareness like that. When I first began my search for what truly changes people's relationships, I was looking for something, how shall we say it, a little more logical. Of course, that was the problem, both in my research and my relationships. It's funny how those two things tend to dovetail in conspicuous ways, isn't it? Looking back now, I understand exactly why my brain was seeking a non-emotional path to change. The only way I survived a childhood with a severely mentally ill mother was to shut my feelings down. I can remember the exact moment my brain struck that bargain. We were at my grandmother's house. I was 4 years old, and I did something to upset my mother, as 4-year-olds reliably do. Imagine that. I stood in front of this raging woman while her fury came at me in waves. The screaming, the veins visible in her neck, the sheer bewildering force of it. Inside me, something was happening that I only have words for now. decades later. Her anger felt like a tsunami penetrating my mind, and I had the distinct sensation that I was disintegrating, that I was somehow losing myself. And in that moment, with time standing still the way it does, only in the most decisive seconds of a life, little 4-year-old Gary made a choice that was, given the circumstances, genuinely wise. My feelings are going to get me killed. I don't need them. Or at least seriously in trouble. At that moment, it was the best deal available. Shut down those feelings. I chose my sanity by banning them. And given this was a nearly weekly occurrence in our home, I would make that same choice again today. And I would tell the little Gary to do so as well. But wisdom for a 4-year-old is not always wisdom for a grown man trying to love someone. If I couldn't feel my own feelings, how could I feel in anyone else's, particularly my first wife? And in a marriage where the gold standard for any lasting relationship is feeling felt, that decision cost me everything I most wanted. Here is what makes it almost funny in retrospect. When I was in my doctoral program in my early 30s, I told my childhood best friend how logical I had become. He deadpanned without missing a beat. Yeah, but you wear your emotions on your sleeves and always have. There it was. My emotions were never really gone. They were simply running the ship below deck while my logical brain stood at the wheel, dutifully following their orders and calling a reason. And underneath it all, the 4-year-old in me was still whispering to the scholar, make sure this research doesn't get into too many feelings. How logical was that? It would have been hilarious if it hadn't been so painful and relationally limiting. There are moments in a scholar's life when research stops being research and becomes something else entirely. Reading the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio was one of those moments for me. Not because his argument was surprising exactly, but because it felt true in the way that only the most essential things feel true. The way you recognize something you always knew, but had never quite found the words for. When I encountered the central argument in his book, Feeling and Knowing, something in me went quiet and still. It felt like coming home to the depths of my being, an invitation to step out of my head and into the very ground of being itself. Feelings, Damasio argues, are not the background noise of mental life needing to be toned down in order to hear what's essential. Rather, feelings are the originating foundation for our very sense of consciousness. Before images, before language, before the elaborate stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what love means, there are feelings. And then he made the point that stopped me in my tracks. Feelings are the originating layer for every thought we've ever had. Every thought, including the logical ones. Let that land. Feelings are embedded in every thought and even in life itself. And by feelings, Damasio means the gut-level physiological sensations that arise from the depths of every cell in your body. And these feelings report back to your brain on the state of your own living organism. If you've ever felt just a little bit off, or had a tummy ache, or just felt depleted, that sensation is a feeling talking to you. Even the word itself tells you something. Emotion comes from the Latin word to move out, and it shares a root with motivation. That's not an accident. Feelings, otherwise known as emotions, have always been about moving us toward life, toward connection, toward love. And sometimes away from those things if they aren't encoded as good for us. Those deep somatic feelings eventually become the emotions you already know how to name: joy, fear, anger, disappointment. Damasio calls the earliest of these alerting sentinels. Their job, from the very beginning of life, is to read what's happening in your body and report back. This is happening in this organism, the one called me, and this is me. In turn, feelings tell you whether you're doing well or not. Others have called these feelings vitality signals from your nervous system. You might even call them emotion-based knowings about your world. Either way, Damasio is unambiguous. Without these feelings, there is no consciousness of me. Let that land. There is no consciousness of me without these feelings. So feelings are not a feature of the mind. They are the origin of it. Stop a moment and take that in. Without feelings, there is no consciousness of me. Emotions are the headwaters of every thought you have ever thought. Once you get this, you'll never look at yourself in the same way again. I know I didn't. Which brings us to Damasio's most clarifying image. Your feelings function as your organismic barometer. Just as atmospheric pressure tells a barometer what weather is building, your cellular and physiological state tells your feeling system what is happening in the deepest centers of your life. The barometer doesn't create the weather. It reads it with extraordinary and faithful accuracy. Without access to that barometer, which we call emotions, you can still function. You can think, you can plan, you can achieve, and you can maintain appearances. You can build a career, raise children, and move through a marriage. What you cannot do is know, in the deepest sense of the word, how your life is actually going, how your relationships are actually going. In other words, without conscious access to your emotions, you are navigating without the proper instruments. The reason this hit me so hard is because this isn't theoretical for me. I know it as a man who spent decades doing exactly that. I simply walk through life and love without the sensors to read so many situations correctly. Luckily, that wasn't the end of my story. And it doesn't have to be the end of yours either. When I finally dealt with the emotions underneath the incident with my mother, things shifted in ways I never imagined. To be sure, I had dealt with that memory in therapy several times. I had insight and new terms to describe it, like dissociation. I had an analysis of my relational patterns called disorganized attachment. I had all the right clinical thoughts about it. But none of that changed my core sense of myself, nor my sense of who I could become, and certainly not my core relational patterns. But when I shifted the feelings I held about having feelings, my feelings came back to me as old friends. It was a homecoming with my heart that I never imagined. As I told one friend early into this deeper work, reconnecting with my feelings is like a blind man seeing again. Women were no longer a mystery. It was astounding. All I had to do was notice their feelings and mine. Every area of my life became easier. Best of all, it was a whole lot easier becoming my best true self. When we realize that we are feeling creatures that think and thinking creatures that feel, it does something profound. It points us back toward the most authentic ground of our being, toward the place where consciousness, our very sense of ourself, begins. Feelings are where the sense of me first arises, and where every experience of love and loss and longing originates before it ever reaches the thinking mind. In fact, whatever form your thoughts take, they were first shaped by the feelings below. Most thoughts are mere explanations of our feelings, whether we are aware of it or not. The cost of losing touch with your gut-level feelings knows no bounds. I learned this not from a research paper, but from a lunch conversation I have never forgotten. About 15 years ago, I had the good fortune of sitting at a table with Mary Jo Franklin during a business event where she was a keynote speaker. In the 1980s and 90s, Mary Jo co-founded one of the leading executive coaching firms of its era, alongside Stephen Covey, author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. She was one of the 2 most sought-after executive coaches by Fortune 500 CEOs, almost exclusively men, during the height of American corporate culture. I was curious how she did that. So I asked her how she was able to help CEOs solve organizational problems when the businesses were so wildly different from one another. How did she develop enough expertise across so many industries to be genuinely useful? It was a good, logical question to ask, right? Well, her answer stunned me. Mary Jo was sitting right beside me at the table. When I asked this question, she put down her fork and looked me square in the eye. She gazed at me with the same quiet pride she used to describe one of her grandchildren earlier in the lunch. And then she said, "Gary, I didn't have the expertise to run any of these businesses. That was never what my coaching was about. Almost every one of these men had ignored their gut-level feelings, and that was what had gotten them and their businesses into trouble. All I did was get these men to listen to their guts. And they soon were able to use all that expertise that made them CEOs in the first place to find their way out. I got them to listen to their feelings, and the rest took care of itself." I have sat with that stunning insight ever since. The problem with these CEOs wasn't expertise. They had that in spades. Their issue was that they weren't reading their own guts, so they kept making the wrong decisions. Have you ever experienced anything like that? What Mary Jo understood intuitively, and what took neuroscience another decade to fully articulate, is precisely what Damasio is telling us. There is no reliable knowing of any kind that does not rest on this felt substrate we call feelings. Not in relationships, not in leadership, not in any domain of human life where genuine wisdom is required. And here's the real tragedy for these men. The barometer was always inside of them. Life freely gave it to them. These men simply had ignored theirs, or had learned to. Now, if that is true in the boardroom, where feelings are perhaps the least thing anyone expects to matter, imagine how much more true it is in the realm of love and relationships. From boardroom to bedroom, feelings are what helps us navigate our realities. So here's the thing I want you to really hear. Feeling isn't the opposite of intelligence. It's part of the very foundation intelligent knowing depends on. So when you disconnect from your feelings, whether it happened in childhood or later in life or culture taught you to do so, or you learned it as just part of being a man, maybe a woman in some circumstances, you don't become more rational. You just become less informed. Now, where did we all get this? Not everyone had a childhood like mine, but I've learned that not every attachment wound comes from childhood. Culture plays its part too. For centuries, Western culture insisted that reason and logic are the only reliable way we know anything. That disconnection isn't just a private wound. It's become a cultural inheritance. And for men, it has become something even more pervasive. A sex role we could ignore only to our shame. We can trace a lot of this back to one very smart man, René Descartes. And boy, is there a story there. The historian Stephen Toulmin looked into Descartes' life and found something that changed how I see the whole story of Western civilization and men. Looking at things in historical context, Toulmin argues that Descartes' turn toward pure reason can't be separated from the trauma of his age. Descartes came of age in a 17th century Europe, descending into the chaos and bloodshed of the 30 Years' War. And like so many trauma survivors, he wanted certainty, something feelings couldn't contaminate. So he decided certainty could only be found in pure reason, stripped of the unreliable testimony of the body and its emotions. There's a name for that split. It's called Cartesian dualism. When that insight landed, I realized in some important ways that Descartes, who is a founding father of our civilization, wanted to lock down his feelings the same way my 4-year-old self did. He tried to escape into logic to find his peace. I saw a little of myself in him, and him in me. Since that insight, I've never looked at our culture's insistence on reason over emotions the same way. And I've never looked at the male sex role the same way either. His influence played a big part in how culture told men to be. Descartes' famous dictum was, "I think, therefore I am." Who hasn't heard that 100 times in their life? So when I talk about his profound influence on culture, that's what I'm talking about. How tragic that he didn't say, "I feel, therefore I am." Or, "I belong, therefore I am." Or maybe, "I am known and loved, therefore I am." And just so, being logical became the unwritten job description of masculinity itself. Men were the rational ones. Emotion was weakness, or at best, a woman's domain. Think clearly, feel minimally, lead with the head, fix rather than feel. In truth, it was a long past cultural level trauma response, dressed up as rigorous philosophy. Generation after generation of men thereafter learned to distrust the very instrument that could tell them how their relationships were actually going. Men who were brilliant at solving external problems and functionally illiterate in the felt language of the people they loved. Men sitting across from partners who were broadcasting emotional information on every available channel through tone, posture, facial expression, the poignant meaning of silence, while their best relational scanners stayed off. I know, because I was one of them. So why am I lingering on these new insights from neuroscience so much? Because the path to deep and lasting transformation starts with feelings and ends with feelings. They are the absolute epicenter of how your brain creates the experience you call your life. If you begin anywhere else, with thought, with insight, with a better story about yourself, you are working on the upper floors of a building whose foundation has not been touched. Yes, we need both the emotional brain and the reasoning brain to create secure relationships. We need both. But we need them to work together in dialogue, supporting each other, with the emotional brain doing the leading in our relationships because that is what it does best. When our reason follows the relational clues of the emotional brain, love thrives. When reason leads without those clues, few good things happen. I want men especially to hear this. In my work with clients, transformation is always emotion-centered. And it's pretty much my relational advice too. I want to understand which feelings are quietly running the show. Often, though not always, those feelings were encoded early, before language, before the elaborate story of who you are was ever assembled. And once I know which ones are running the show, I help the client's brain replace them with the feelings that belong to a securely attached brain. And yes, sometimes those feelings came later in life. We work on replacing those too. In the episodes ahead, I'll show you that process and how it works so you can begin coming home to secure love. So here's the takeaway for today. The experience you call yourself did not begin with a thought. It began with a feeling. And your experience can be transformed the same way it was formed, from the felt layer up. This is science talking, believe it or not. Once you know the science of relationships, it's logical to include your emotional brain in the party we call love, as ironic as that may seem. If you are a man, let this land especially. You were born to feel. That is not sentiment. That is science. I just thought I'd get all of this out into the open before we go deeper. Along the way, we'll be educating your logical brain on the enormous importance of your emotional brain for creating more relationship savvy. And when we do that, your reasoning about love will be so much better. So, take a moment. Check in with your body. Notice what your gut or your heart or some other part of your body has been trying to say, perhaps for years, perhaps for decades. Sit with it long enough to hear the truth your body has been carrying all along. Listen to your feelings. What are they saying? They've been waiting for you to listen for a long time, maybe. And just know that the road to lasting change starts there. If this episode landed anywhere in you, please subscribe to the podcast. My hope is that you keep coming back to relearn what secure love feels like, one honest conversation at a time. And if you're a woman who knows a man that just might need to hear these things from another man, please feel free to share this episode with them, if it feels right. This is Safe to Love Again, where we come home to secure love and learn how to choose and keep real love.